Bystanders were shocked by the fatal mistake that this pilot made, and it's not what you think. Let's take a look and see what happened.
That? Heavy? It's wind. No.
I'm Hoover and welcome to Pilot Debrief. This was a terrible tragedy and it resulted in the pilot in command dying and the pilot passenger in the backseat suffered minor injuries. Now the NTSB said the probable cause of this accident was the pilot's exceedance of the airplane's critical angle of attack during the initial climb after takeoff, which resulted in an aerodynamic stall. But they don't really explain in their final report what the root cause of the accident was. Or in other words, what fatal mistake did the pilot make that most likely resulted in him stalling the aircraft. This incident took place on October 6, 2020 at Treetop Airport near Spirit Lake, Idaho. It's a private use airport just north of Coeur d'Alene and it has one grass strip runway that is oriented east-west and is 3,000 feet long. The pilot flying is Michael Mills, and while researching this video, I learned that he was fairly well known in the Alaskan bush pilot community. And bush pilots are basically the guys that do the flying that no one else likes to do because they're flying around in remote wilderness locations, in and out of dirt strips and short grass runways all the time. Basically, a lot of the places that commercial planes could never get to. And according to the investigation, he holds a commercial certificate with several ratings, and he has about 10,000 hours of flight time. Flying with him in the backseat is Brendan Duddy. Now he's also a pilot and he has an airline transport certificate and about 7,200 hours of flight time, but he is not an instructor. And this is notable because Mike had recently purchased this aircraft and he wanted Brendan to fly with him to help keep an eye out, and they had actually already accomplished one water landing and takeoff before they flew into the Treetop private airstrip, and this was an airfield that Brendan had flown in and out of many times. According to an interview with Brendan after the accident, he said that before takeoff they performed a run-up check and everything was good. Now as they began the takeoff roll, the NTSB said that a review of the video of the takeoff revealed that the airplane became airborne about 1,100 feet down the runway. But you can see in the diagram that Mike begins the rotation when the data shows they were doing about 34 knots and they were only about 500 feet down the runway, so it takes about another 600 feet for the plane to get up to about 48 knots and actually get airborne. And you can see that in the video here. See how the front wheels come off the ground, but then it's a few more seconds before they actually get airborne, and then watch what happens next. They stay in ground effect for about 3 to 4 seconds, and Brendan told the NTSB that because they were staying in ground effect, he actually thought that Mike was going to land the plane, but instead Mike just pulled back on the stick. Now at this point, they only have about 20 seconds before they impact the ground, and I think Mike realizes he's not getting the climb performance that he was expecting, and you can actually see in the video how he kind of lowers the nose for a second and they level off and maybe even lose a little bit of altitude. And by this point, their ground speed had actually increased to about 60 miles per hour, and Mike tries to climb again. And that's when the aircraft reaches a maximum altitude of about 75 feet above the runway before it loses airspeed and starts descending because it's stalling. Brendan stated that the airplane felt like it was heavy during the takeoff. Possibly he was thinking that the pontoons were full of water, but the post-accident investigation revealed that this most likely wasn't the case, and also there was only about 11 gallons of gas on board, so a little bit more than half a tank. And the weight of the two pilots meant that the plane was well under the max weight of the aircraft and within the weight and balance envelope for normal flight. The NTSB also did a sound spectrum analysis of the engine based on the audio from the video and determined that there was nothing wrong with the engine, and it was operating at just under 5,500 RPM, which is about 94% of the rated engine speed, and it stayed that way all the way until impact. But the question is, did they achieve the appropriate takeoff and climb speeds? And the NTSB took a look at this and said that this was a Rans S-7 Courier aircraft, which normally has a tailwheel configuration. But since this one was modified with the amphibious floats, it was considered experimental and it didn't have a pilot operating handbook. Instead, they had to reference the handbook for the tailwheel configuration, and that says that normal takeoffs are done with the flaps up and a normal climb speed of 65 to 70 miles per hour, or you can have the flaps half extended, but in that case, they should be left in that position until all obstacles are cleared, airspeed exceeds 60 miles per hour, and the airplane gains a minimum altitude of 100 feet AGL. Keep in mind that Mike is only doing about 50 miles per hour when they get airborne, and he never gets faster than 60 miles an hour, and the highest they got was only 75 feet in the air. And also keep in mind that the trees off the end of the runway are 60 feet tall. Also, the NTSB report doesn't really talk about what position that the flaps are in when they take off or when they crash, but buried in the interviews is someone from Rans that said the flaps appear to be set to the first of 3 notches, and that's what's used by most pilots for takeoff. Now the next obvious question is, what's the stall speed? And the handbook says that if you have the flaps half retracted, then the stall speed is 48 miles per hour. And see this part right here in the video when Mike makes that second move to pitch the aircraft up, probably trying to make sure he could clear the trees. He's only doing about 58 miles per hour. However, that's the GPS reported ground speed, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But first, you can see in the video that when the wing starts to dip to the left, that's the point that the wing is stalled, and that's what's causing the plane to roll in that direction. And basically, they stay in a stall all the way until impact. Now let's talk about some of the details that the NTSB didn't really dig into too much, which in my opinion reveals the fatal mistake made on this flight. At the time of the takeoff, the skies are clear, but the temperature is 27 degrees Celsius. So that means that even though the airport elevation is 2,500 feet, the density altitude is almost 4,500 feet. And anytime you have hot temperatures at a high elevation airport, density altitude is always a concern because a higher density altitude means you're going to have a longer takeoff distance and a reduced rate of climb. Basically, your aircraft is not going to perform the same way that it would if you were down at sea level, so it's definitely something that you want to consider when it comes to aircraft performance. Next, I mentioned ground speed earlier, and all of the flight data that was captured by the GPS device is reporting the aircraft track ground speed. So in this diagram here, a recorded ground speed of 51 knots is about 58 miles per hour, but we have to take into consideration the wind. At the time they take off, the winds at the closest airport, which is Coeur d'Alene, were reported to be 240 at 7 knots, and Mike had taken off from runway 7, so that's almost a direct tailwind, but it wasn't possible to determine what the exact winds were at the treetop airstrip when Mike took off. But you can see in the video there are some flags blowing away from the camera, so it looks like a little bit of a quartering tailwind, or at least some sort of tailwind component when they take off. However, remember that a tailwind doesn't change your indicated airspeed or the amount of lift you generate. The airplane is still going to have the same rate of climb based on any given indicated airspeed. A tailwind just means you're going to cover more ground while you're doing that climb, and so it's going to take you a longer distance to climb to a certain altitude. And the other thing to keep in mind is that with an airstrip like this in the middle of the forest, the temperature and the winds can shift significantly once you get above the tree line. So as Mike starts to climb, he could have been approaching those trees in front of him a lot sooner than he expected based on whatever the tailwind might have been. But there's one more very important piece to this investigation that we haven't talked about, and it's only briefly mentioned in the NTSB attachment where they interview Warren Longden. Now, Warren is a certified flight instructor, and he's the owner of the airport property, and he's also the guy that helped rescue Brendan out of the plane. He told the investigator that he wouldn't have taken off uphill on runway 7, but what he says next is probably one of the most important parts of the whole investigation, in my opinion. Now, take a look at this image here, and you can see these white markers, they annotate the runway. And right here is where they started their takeoff roll. So you can see all of the space behind them when they're about to start rolling. And Warren said that if Mike had taken off the other direction on runway 25, he would have had an extra 2,500 feet before trees even became an issue. But if both pilots had taken a second to consider the takeoff threats, they probably would have decided that on a hot day with a high density altitude and a plane that was relatively new to Mike with a tailwind, they should maybe take off on runway 25, especially because if they were to lose an engine or something went wrong, they would have even more ground to recover. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out this other one on the screen here, and I'll see you next time.